Good morning, warriors. So here we go again. Today is Tuesday, March 17th, or at least it should be Tuesday, March 17th when you're doing this. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the early medieval period in Western Europe. Now, we've been talking about the medieval period for a very, very, very long time in this course. Basically, the Middle Ages globally spans from about 600 CE to 1450 CE. But when we talk about the Middle Ages, the thing that most people imagine is Western Europe. So today we're going to get into that. Our main topics today are going to be the establishment of the Frankish kingdom, that is modern France. We're going to be talking about feudalism, and we're also going to be talking about the role of the Catholic Church in Western Europe. So those are our three major topics. I promise I'll have you done with this in less than 30 minutes. So you need to have your note packet out, the downloadable notes that I put up on the blog, or paper and pencil to take notes as we go. So here we go. Okay. So we're really covering the period after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to about 1000 CE today. So if you remember way back in Unit 3, we talked about this side of what used to be the Roman Empire. We talked about the Byzantine Empire. Remember in 395, you had Diocletian formally split the Roman Empire into two parts. And this meant that you had the Eastern Empire, which stuck around for a very long time, up until about 1453, because of the trade routes coming in from the Silk Road, because it's a smaller geographic area, and frankly, because control was easier in this part of the Mediterranean. Culture was a little bit more tied together. Plus, they didn't have invading groups coming from the Hunnic peoples into Germanic areas that pushed the the Germanic tribes into Western Europe. So as a result of all of this, what you have is the collapse of Western Europe into a period of disunity. So when we talk about the medieval period in Western Europe, we're really talking about the kind of in-between stage between Western Rome and the Renaissance, which is what our next unit of study is going to be. So after the collapse of the Western Roman state, essentially, those tribal Germanic groups move into these regions and they establish a number of different kingdoms. Spain is conquered by a number of tribal groups, but primarily the Visigoths. You have the Gaulish peoples the Frankish people in Gaul. I'm swapping my terms around. And moving over here into Britain, you have the Angles and the Saxons. The Angles will take some territory and they'll call it Angleland. This is where we get the term England. And what we have are these really fairly small states that develop. So in Gaul, we have the Franks settle. In Britain, we've got the Anglo-Saxons. Now, this is not a European history course. You should have figured that out by now. So I'm not going to go into the specific history of every single European state. We just can't do that. So today we're primarily going to focus in here on the Frankish kingdom, what becomes eventually France. So, in terms of the Franks, the earliest leader that is really critically important is a fellow by the name of Clovis. Clovis ruled sometime between about 466 and 511 CE, and he was an early Frankish sort of warlord, frankly. He claimed the title of king, and then he tried to secure his rights to that kingship by executing pretty much anybody who disagreed with him and any family rivals that existed. However, one thing that Clovis was very clever about was that he recognized that the only existing power structure in Western Europe that really was powerful enough to do anything was the Catholic Church headed in Rome. And so as a result, Clovis decides to make a political choice to convert to Roman Catholicism. He's making this as a political alliance. Whether or not he had a deep religious conviction in his conversion is deeply questionable, frankly. He was not a nice guy. I'm not entirely sure that he took like the teachings of Jesus to heart here. But it made political sense for him to join with sort of the other big power in the region. By establishing this link between the Frankish population and the Catholic Church, you see that the Frankish kingdom grows and it becomes more and more powerful. By the 8th century in particular, the leader of the Franks is a fellow by the name of Charles Martel. Now, Charles Martel is sometimes his nickname is Charles the Hammer, which is a great nickname. Charles Martel is also Roman Catholic. By now, the Franks have been Catholic for a long time. And he too is very closely allied to the Pope in Rome, to the Roman Catholic Church. And he demonstrates his loyalty to the Roman Catholic Church in 732, when Charles Martel leads Frankish soldiers against the Umayyad Caliphate at the Battle of Tours. Remember, we talked about the Battle of Tours like way back when in Unit 3 when we were talking about the expansion of the Islamic Caliphates. Here we are again looking at it from the European side. Because of Charles Martel's victory over the Umayyad Caliphate, the spread of Islam into Western Europe is really halted. This makes Charles Martel a strong ally of the Pope, and he is granted more lands, he is able to conquer more territory, and this begins what is known as the Carolingian dynasty in what is going to become France. His children and their children after him are going to be part of this line. Carolingian is just a fancy way of saying like the line of Charles. Carol is just the feminine form of Charles in France. So at any rate, Charles Martel kind of begins this dynasty. One of the people of his line, one of the later rulers of his line, is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the French for Charles the Great. That's what his name means. Charlemagne, also being a Frankish leader here, was also Catholic. And he had a reputation for really kind of creating the modern state in Western Europe. He fought against a number of other Germanic groups all throughout Western Europe, especially those who were not Catholic. Now, many Germanic groups throughout Western Europe at the time of Charlemagne, in the late 700s, early 800s, were still pagan. They were polytheistic. They worshipped local gods, or they practiced some very small breakaway sects of non-Catholic Christianity. And Charlemagne saw it as kind of a holy quest to try and bring people closer to the Catholic Church, and he did this through violent conversion. I want you to be very clear on this. This was not peaceable. This wasn't a join the church if you feel like it. This was a join or die situation. Because of his adamancy, his adamant position about the defense of the Catholic Church, he was seen as a great ally by the Pope. And in 800 CE, Pope Leo III decided to name Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, that title is a bit misleading here because the Roman Empire that we were used to talking about in Unit 2 does not exist anymore. What does exist, however, are kingdoms around Italy and kingdoms in what is today Germany and then France. And Pope Leo III declares that Charlemagne has dominion over all of them. But the Holy Roman Empire is a really weak political entity. It's not particularly holy, not particularly Roman, and doesn't stay an empire for very long. But Charlemagne does establish a number of really important things during the course of his rule. Firstly, he was a great believer in education. He himself really struggled with literacy. There's some interesting scholarship that suggests that he might have struggled with something like dyslexia, but he believed that literacy and education really needed to be more spread. By 800 CE, it was very rare for the average person to be able to read or write in any language in Western Europe. Really, the only people who had any degree of literacy in Western Europe as of 800 CE were largely those in the church. Kings even didn't necessarily have to be literate. You had scribes for that. So Charlemagne is also often credited with the establishment of medieval feudalism in Western Europe. Um, with the granting of all of his territory through the Holy Roman Empire, that was far too much territory for one man to actually oversee effectively. So what he did was he established rule through intermediaries. He gave portions of the empire's land to various vassals and nobles who he trusted, and those people would then rule in his name. So Charlemagne is credited with kind of establishing the formalized system of feudalism in Western Europe. And this is a really important idea. So this right here is an illuminated illustration of Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Here he is. That's Charlemagne. This is the Pope. This is Pope Leo III. Now, let's talk for a little bit about how European feudalism actually works. The system is basically that the king has the ability to give titles and land to nobles, and then those nobles are able to give some privileges to soldiers who serve them, and when called for, those soldiers can serve the king as well. Nobles are also expected to give land and legal protection to the peasants, and in return, the peasants are supposed to provide nobles with rent, which then goes from the nobles also back to the king. So we've talked about feudalism in multiple cultures. In Western Europe, the land that is granted to a noble by the king is called a fief. And that is different from what we saw in, say, Japan. In Japan, the land granted to a noble by the emperor was called a shoen. But here they're called a fief, and the land controlled by a noble is a fiefdom. So in return for the status and wealth given to them by the kings, vassals owe their king certain things. They owe them total allegiance. So the king says jump, you say how high. If the king needs to go to war, he doesn't have his own standing army. He has to go to his nobles and say, I need some men to fight a war. And then the nobles have to give him soldiers. And if the king requests it, nobles can be required to come and serve the king at court, essentially be like diplomats or translators or work in terms of commerce. Like they have to do these jobs. It's not optional because if you choose not to do it, then the king can just take your fief away from you. Additionally, kings frequently would travel about their kingdoms or empires to make sure that everything was in order. So like Charlemagne was constantly on progress. That's what we call it. He was on progress, progressing around his empire to make sure that everybody was aware of who was in charge, that they knew that they were going to be overseen. Like he didn't just hole up in a city and then just wait for the revenue to come into him. He went and visited his nobles to make sure that they were loyal, that they were doing what he was saying. And when he did this, he would then stay with his nobles for sometimes months or weeks at a time. And while he did that, the nobles owed him food and lodging of a status that was appropriate to a king. This cost a huge amount of money, and so it served a double purpose. It meant that nobles couldn't acquire too much money because the king could sometimes just show up and drain your funds, and that meant they couldn't rebel against him. It also meant that the peasants weren't just loyal to their nobles. They knew who their king was because their king showed his face. Additionally, if the king actually fought in a battle, which was very common during the early Middle Ages, they were warriors and they actually went to battle. If he was taken in battle, usually kings weren't killed. They were taken as ransom, as hostages for ransom. Their nobles would be forced to pay that. So then the question is, that's a lot for nobles to put up with. So why do it? Well, because so long as you aren't the low man on the totem pole, so long as you aren't the peasant at the bottom of the system, you can do the same thing to everybody below you. So if you are a duke, that's a very high noble status, and that means that you could demand the same thing of a lord or a marquis or a vicomte. You could require all of these things of people lower than you on the social status. That's the end of this video. I only have 15 minutes recording time, so I'm going to transition over to the second video here.